All right, sociocracy in nonprofits. So we're going to cover some key concepts of sociocracy and then the applications to nonprofits in terms of organizational structure, decision-making, and feedback. And then we'll go through the examples. I always start with Gandhi, with social change, because for me, that's where I'm coming from in terms of approaching sociocracy. Sociocracy as a contribution to social change, to kind of creating the world the most beautiful world we know is possible. And Gandhi's frame of social change had three aspects. One is the challenge program, saying no to that which hurts people. So we go out there and protest, saying yes to what we want to be creating. So sociocracy for all. Sociocracy for me is one aspect of the constructive program. Nonprofits themselves may be part of the constructive program, or they may be funding or supporting challenge programs. And then for Gandhi, the most important piece was the spiritual purification. How are we the instruments of the change we want to see? How do we relate both to our comrades, compatriots, the people we work with, so that we are most effective as we can be? How do we deal with the people who are on the other side from our positions and treat them still respectfully as human beings? So that's hard work. And so that's part of why for Gandhi, that was the most important. And we in Sociocracy for All, that's part of why we have some emphasis on nonviolent communication or other ways of strengthening our own, how we show up in the world. And it also relates to how we show up in relationship to power dynamics, understanding, the history of oppression and how that still shows up in our meetings. So next key concept, so sociocracy. I assume that not everybody here fully knows what sociocracy is. So decisions by those who work together. Ocracy is governance, and socio, the socios. So decisions, governance by those who associate together, decisions by those who work together in the service of the aim or the purpose of the organization. For example, to build houses with and for the homeless in the city of Atlanta. And the aim is in service of a larger perspective of a mission, which might be to end homelessness or to provide decent housing, that everyone in the world should have decent housing. The Sociocracy for All's mission is making resources for learning and implementing sociocracy accessible to everyone. That's part of the for all that we want to make. We want to reach everyone. So about the core elements of sociocracy. So one is decision-making by consent, which is different than majority rule, different than consensus, etc. Organizational structure through a pattern of connected teams, connected circles. And I'll explain all of this a bit more later. And the third element is continuous evolution through feedback. So we're not static, we keep learning and growing as we go. All of this is with the underlying values of effectiveness and egalitarianism. Every voice matters, and we want to be able to get things done. And we are kind of like the picture shows, almost like a steering wheel. It's, how do we steer, which is about governance, towards achieving our aim. So that's the essence of what sociocracy is about, and I'll break that down a bit more. So how do we apply this to organizational structure? Traditionally, we might think of organizational structure as there's the board, there's a management team, the vice president or whoever they are, and the departments. And this applies to nonprofits as well as to for-profits, in general. So how do we change this when we look at sociocracy? We are creating a circle structure. So we name our teams as circles, and what were departments before are now these three major circles that you see here. They're still departments, and they still have a management team, and they still have a board of directors. But what's different is this principle of subsidiarity, the redistribution of authority from the top out to the periphery. So it's no longer the board in charge of everything, making all the decisions, or even the management team being in charge and telling everybody else what to do. It's the circles really on the periphery that are carrying out most of the work, and for the most part, having authority and responsibility to make their own decisions. Another aspect is that all circles, or at least most of the circles, particularly towards the core, are double linked, meaning there are two people serving on both what we might call the parent circle or super circle and the subcircle. So you see that here, and I'll say more about that. Yes, the more I'll say about that is that those two people are the leader and delegate of the circle, and both of those positions are chosen by consent. The management team, or the coordinating circle, or what we tend to call in sociocracy the general circle, how is that composed? It is composed of the leader and delegate of the core departments. So those, in this diagram, you see 3 core departments, and so there are 6 people, the leaders and delegates of those 3 core departments, and the executive director, who is typically selected by the board, or it could be selected actually upwards from the management circle. So that's the group of 7 in this picture who would be the management team, which is responsible for the day-to-day activities, the day-to-day oversight of the organization. And then we have the board. The board, or what we tend to call in sociocracy the mission circle, because we want to draw attention to its purpose, which is keeping the big picture of what is the mission of this organization, what's the long view. The mission circle would have the leader and delegate of the management circle serving on the board, or mission circle, and they would have outside members serving on the board according to whatever the needs are of the organization. And it would have representatives from any stakeholders that it might have. So the differences between a sociocratic nonprofit is that on the board would be staff with full consent decision-making rights. So the executive director and a delegate from the general circle would be serving on the board as full members. And there would be, depending upon the nature of the organization, there may be some stakeholder representatives on that board as well. And those can be of different kinds. It could be, if it's a school, it might be a parents circle. If it's a museum, it might be the Friends of the Museum group. It could be a volunteers circle. It could be a community-based organization related, that it's in the geographic area or in some way related to the work of the nonprofit. Another key difference or perspective when we think about sociocracy and nonprofits, and that's the role of volunteers. That as much as possible, we treat volunteers as staff. So they might even have contracts. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what you're intending to do, and here is how you're going to get paid, which is not in money because they're volunteers, but they're going to get, and there's an exchange. They're going to get feedback about, that supports their personal growth, that tells them the impact of their work, because that's why they're volunteering, in order to contribute to the impact of the nonprofit. So that's part of what's really important in an exchange with volunteers. Treat them seriously and give them the kind of feedback that makes it worth their participation. So it's not just a percentage off the ticket to go to the museum, but it's also how they participate and what kind of feedback of their participation they receive, and that they can be decision makers. Not all volunteers are alike, so some are only there for very short periods of time, and they may not have full decision-making rights. But any volunteer who's more fully present can be part of a circle, participate in the decision-making in that circle, along with paid staff. And as I said earlier, the volunteers could be a circle that has representation on the board. So that was about structure, and I want to talk a little bit about decision-making. We make decisions by consent, which is different than typical in most nonprofits, where maybe they might seek consensus on the board, but they wind up ultimately making a decision by majority vote. And once having made the vote, the rest of the organization more typically works autocratically. You know, the managers, the executive director tells people what to do. That's not all nonprofits work exactly that way, but that's, you know, that's the general tendency. And consent is different than consensus. You know? So let me just back up for a moment. So the reason why not majority vote is majority vote has winners and losers. And we're seeking to have all voices heard and be involved in decisions that they can unite behind. Consensus often raises issues of seeking the best decision, seeking perfection, seeking unanimity, whereas consent has a kind of a different perspective. The question is not, do we all agree, but can we work with this decision? And the key element there is the distinction between where we have an objection and where we have consent. If we think that this proposal that we're trying to decide about would harm our ability to achieve the aim, then we object. You know, that's our responsibility. If we don't like it so much, but we don't see harm possibly happening, then it might fall within our range of tolerance. And we would say, yeah, okay, you know, I would consent to this. It's not my preference, but we're not trying to seek to make decisions by everyone's preferences, but by everyone's range of tolerance. Is this good enough for now, safe enough to try? Can we, you know, if we're worried about it, let's give it a short term and review it again. Key element in decision-making in sociocracy is the rounds. Everyone speaks one by one. And there are many kinds of rounds. There's the opening round where we check in and say how we're showing up in a meeting. There's a closing round of a meeting where we talk about how that experience was to be in that meeting. And there's all the decision-making aspects of clarification round on a proposal, reaction round to the proposal, consent round to the proposal. The rounds are critical because they are what affirm, establish egalitarianism, that every voice matters. We use standard meeting formats that creates a sense of reliability, clarity, and shared accountability. So as I was just saying, there's an administrative round, an opening round, dealing with the administration of the meeting, consent to the agenda, which is an important very piece here, which shifts the power from whoever might have prepared the agenda to the team as a whole. Where the circle as a whole is saying, we consent, this is now our agenda. So very important there, because that's the again, sharing power. That's what that means. And then there's the elements within the agenda, the different items, and I won't go into depth into that now. Finishing up a meeting with updating the backlog means, what items did we not cover that we need to come back to later on. Closing round. How was this meeting in terms of productivity, in terms of our process, in terms of our interpersonal relations? Third element is the feedback. And one of those elements of the feedback is what I was just talking about, the closing round, where we're talking about how the meeting went, and it's feedback about how we could improve into the future. Feedback comes from, in sociocracy, comes from the cybernetics, from engineering, from the process of lead, do, measure. You make a plan. For example, you plan the agenda. You do it. For example, you carry out the agenda, and then you measure. You evaluate how the meeting went. So that cycle of lead, do, measure applies to not only a meeting, but to any kind of workflow process that you might have, to evaluating, programs of the nonprofit, et cetera. So all those, various ways to apply feedback, evaluating meetings, policies, all policies and roles have terms, and we review them, see how well things are going, see if we want to make any changes. I said the selection process for roles like leader, facilitator, other kinds of roles would be done through a consent process. And that consent process, the style of it is that I would be saying something like, I nominate Ted to be the facilitator because, and then I say out the reasons, because he's well organized, because he listens well. And so I'm saying it out loud to the other people in the group. So it's not secret ballot. It's completely out in the open, and it's all framed in the positive. Why do we want somebody for the role that we have? And we have already identified what are the qualities that we would seek in that role. So we're speaking to those qualities when we nominate people. So there's a lot, you get a lot of feedback about each other and how you see each other when you do a selection process. Circle feedback is another frame where we would go around in the circle, and each person in the circle says, here's what I have brought to this group. Here's what I see as my strengths and challenges that I've brought to this group. And the other people in the circle would be saying, well, yes, you brought that, and also you brought this. And so you hear from the other people in your circle, in your team, how they have experienced you, and then you get to reflect. Thank you for sharing all this information with me. Here's the meaning I'm making of that. So it's feedback-rich environments. And this diagram at the bottom here just shows sort of the lead, do, measure process, how we over and over again, as we give feedback, we're hopefully improving our capacity to work effectively towards achieving our aim. So that's the overview of sociocracy. And now let's take a look at some of the examples. Nonprofits that are sociocratic exist in many different forms. There are independent schools, there might be units of colleges, permaculture associations, social change, and social service organizations. You can see some examples of those in our case studies on our website. In this session, I'm going to just look at 3 different ones. Maker's Mill, which is a makerspace community center in a town in New Hampshire, US. Pulse, which is the Partnership for Undergraduate Life Science Education. It's an association of university deans and professors again, also in the United States, and we're going to look at Sociocracy for All itself. First, I just want to look again at the generic organizational structure of an organization. So you have a mission circle with some outside experts. You have a stakeholder circle, which could be, a donor circle. It could be, again, the friends of, all the different ways that this could be named. But there may or may not exist. The stakeholder circle may or may not exist, but there may be one or more. And then there's your general circle, looking at the day-to-day management of things, making sure communication is flowing throughout the organization. And then there are the major department circles, and they may be subcircles. And this is like a fractal. This could just extend and extend and extend, many, many, many subcircles and subcircles of subcircles. Each of those, and you can sort of see by the design, is implied that the double link. Okay. So here's Maker's Mill. They are intending to be a meeting place and a maker space where people from the region can come in and do all sorts of metal work, pottery work, jewelry work, all sorts of things. So learn trades, share skills with each other, etc., serving as a community center. So very traditionally, they have a top circle and they have a management team with an executive director. The double link, that's the arrows here are implying that double link. So the executive director and the delegate from the management team serve on the board. This is a relatively new organization. Right now, they've got 3 main circles. The fundraising, trying to really raise the funds to make this makerspace fully functional, programming and volunteer committee, and the marketing public relations circle. Over time, I'm going to imagine that this, particularly the programs circle, is going to wind up having a number of subcircles as more programs become mature and have their own sets of people managing them. So the principle of subsidiarity means distributing authority. So eventually here, there might be a pottery circle that's just a circle of people within the makerspace that has authority and responsibility over the space in this building that's dedicated to working with pottery. And they have their own budget, they have their own decision-making authority within some limits because they're operating in a larger space with others and some limits of budget, etc. Here is Pulse, the Partnership for Undergraduate Life Science Education. Their aim is to support a student-centered evidence-based teaching. So it's not so much banking information, just jamming science information into people's brains, but much more learning by doing for the students. And they're a national association of professors and deans of departments of universities in the life sciences. So they have 3 main circles. They have their administrative aspect, which deals with administration and membership, and also paying attention to the editorial policies of what they publish. They have the products and services circle, and got sub-circles under that are looking at, what are they actually delivering to the universities? What are the products that they give to the universities, like recognition of a university that their department is functioning according to the principles that they support. So in a sense, like certification, if you will. And they have the regions, they're geographically organized so that people can get together regionally and discuss how they're doing their work and promoting this student-centered evidence-based teaching in the universities and colleges in their geographic region. There's an interesting circle here called assessment. And that circle is got multiple links. They are not, what are they doing? They're looking at how the organization is carrying out its work and making sure that there is alignment between the different regions, the way recognition is happening, the way the ambassadors, which are again, professors who are going out from one college to another and saying, here's the way we work. Why don't you consider, changing some of the way you work? So that's what the ambassadors do. So making sure that there's quality, control, and consistency across all the elements. The Fellows Council is the collection of all the members of the organization. So all the professors and deans that are part of this. And then the board is the smaller group. There are fellows councils meetings on some regular basis, and they mostly give feedback to the board for whatever decisions it might need to make. So the all fellows meetings tend to be more feedback oriented, but there are several elements that they give to the all fellows for decision making. And lastly here, another example is Sociocracy for All. We have a mission circle and leader and delegate from the general circle. Ted is the executive director of Sociocracy for All. I am currently the delegate from the general circle to the mission circle, but I will be shifting out of that and somebody else will be selected from the general circle to be on the mission circle. And part of the value of that is I'm a founder. So it would be good for me to perhaps, I might wind up staying on the mission circle as kind of a founder emeritus kind of thing, but there'll be somebody from the staff, somebody who's been working with the organization who represents, staff perspective, member perspective. We are basically a member-run nonprofit. So when I say staff, I'm meaning everybody. We have several people who are paid, either part-time, full-time, not many, and then we have a larger and increasing number of people who are getting stipends or a small amount of money to help support projects happening. But most of our 180 so members are volunteers. They are not paid. They're simply doing this because they want to contribute to social change in the world and because they're getting a lot of learning through the process of working with Sociocracy for All. Many of them are wanting to develop themselves as consultants or as people who are working in another organization and trying to strengthen the application of sociocracy in their other organizations. So that's mission circle, general circle. We have the content circle, which is what produces the books, the articles, the websites, the forums. We have lots of ways that we're generating content. So there's multiple circles, and we didn't put them all in here with names because there are too many, but you can sort of see the implication that there are others there. Then there is the ecosystems circle, and there are multiple subcircles under that. Ecosystems is about how is sociocracy applied in different areas. So sociocracy and cooperatives, sociocracy and nonprofits, sociocracy and permaculture, sociocracy and schools and education. So applications into fields. And we have another circle called the international circle, and that has its subcircles according to locality or language. So Spanish, Portuguese, Scandinavia, Italy, things like that. We have a membership circle that deals with orienting new members, and with also under it is finances and some generic IT support. So that's how we're organized. A couple of other comments to make is, you know, all organizations need to have legal documentation. So what is the legal documentation for nonprofits? Well, there's, in the US anyway, we have what we call articles of incorporation, and the wording of that is pretty much defined by the US federal agency, the Internal Revenue Center. Any country would have its own, you know, what's the basic legal form for a foundation or a nonprofit or a benevolent association. Different countries name these things differently. The articles of incorporation is usually fairly short, and in language is fairly prescribed. Then you have the bylaws, which may say a bunch of things about how decisions are made and how the board is formed and so on. And then there's policies and procedures, which is the much longer document, which one element of that would be a governance, and other elements are all the other kinds of policies that you may have. You know, conflict of interest policy, privacy policies, policies that affect different elements of the work that you're doing. At least in the United States, and I don't know about other countries, there are really no rules about what to put in each document. However, if you're not explicit about your governance, then tradition or the basic government provided templates would apply. So if you don't say that you're working with, you know, by consent, then the assumption will be that you're majority rule, Robert's Rules of Order kind of organization. And the only places where that winds up mattering is if you get sued. If you have to go to court, then a judge is going to say, well, how do I make a judgment on this issue? Let me see your governance documents. Okay, these are your governance documents, and according to your governance documents, you know, I would rule on this issue this way. But if you have no governance documents, then, well, since you are silent about this, then I will assume the traditional forms that may be the fallback that government provides, or that is tradition. You know, Robert's Rules of Order, majority vote, etc. And of course, I'm talking mostly about the US experience, but even within the United States, every state has somewhat different policies. Every country has its own way of doing things. So you have to look at, you know, when you're looking at legal documentation, you have to apply that to the country that you're in, the jurisdiction you're in. Here's a bit of sample bylaw. This is from the makerspace. So this is a small nonprofit NGO in a state in the United States. I don't have all the detail, but just wanted to, so you could see the kind of titles that are in the bylaws, you know, name of the organization, its purpose. And then there's a brief comment on sociocratic governance, just noting that sociocratic governance, you know, is defined as the method of governance applying to all levels of the corporation, and establishes equivalence among its members within their domain of responsibility. So we're putting sociocracy into the bylaws as a generic, you know, statement framework, but we don't detail it here. Governance principles, you know, the thing that I was talking to you earlier, circles, consent, decision making, continuous evolution, make just a comment about those here. And then 5, 6, and 7, what you notice here is that each of them say, yes, we have members, yes, we have a board of directors, yes, we have meetings, and as defined or described in the policies and procedures, because we shift a lot of that description into the policy documents. So here's kind of a table of contents for the governance section of a policies and procedures manual. Again, governance principles, the circle structure. What do you do about visitors attending meetings? What are the roles? How do you make this, review of the decision-making, basis of objections? All the different policies that govern how you work. And here we have an appendix. There's a facilitation guide sheet, like a support for decision-making. The organizational structure would be a diagram, like what we showed you earlier. What's the diagram of the organization? And the table of circle aims and domains is taking that diagram and putting it into a table with, okay, this circle has this as its purpose and this as its authority and responsibility. Domains is a key word in sociocracy as we distinguish what's the authority of one circle versus the authority of a different circle. So you don't have overlaps or gaps in your work. So I've been talking a lot. I'm going to say a few more things, and then we're going to, then we'll head into a kind of break for your exploration, for your reflection, and then do the Q&A. So typical questions that we get when we talk about nonprofits. Is the mission circle the same people as on the board? Because we use this phrase, mission circle, and it's like, yeah, usually it is. Sometimes a distinction is needed because of legal requirements or the existing bylaws of the organization. If you have a nonprofit that says, oh, staff can't be on the board, or nobody on the board can get paid for any of the work that the nonprofit does. Those are policies that you might have now, but that can be changed. Usually those are not cast in stone. If you change those, you might have to persuade your funders that this is actually a reasonable thing to do. Because the concern is that, we don't want to have nonprofit officers or people being able to have their hands on the till to be able to do private profit off the work of the nonprofit. But with sociocracy, we do want people on that board who sometimes are getting paid. They might, for example, the delegate from the general circle. If your current policies don't allow, or some other aspect of the law does not allow that, there's always a workaround. And the workaround that we tend to use or comment on is what's called a committee of the whole, which means you have the meeting of everybody you want in the room, make a decision from that, and then the formal board of directors can, in a sense, rubber stamp what was done. In the United States, this was done, I believe, with the Constitution, where there were more delegates in the room than were actually delegates. And so this was kind of the Benjamin Franklin idea. Okay, let's make a decision together, and then the formal delegates say, yeah, okay, this is the decision that we make. And when you go to this is the decision that we make, that can be called the consent agenda, meaning we're not going to discuss this. We're just going to say, do we consent or not? Yes, no. So it's a 5-minute agenda, not an hour-long discussion. And both committee of the whole and consent agenda are actually items that are discussed in Robert's Rules of Order. So this is not a Sociocratic invention. Sometimes what we get is, oh, we have a working board. How does that fit? Maybe it's a board that doesn't really have staff or only has one staff person, the executive director, and everybody else is on the board and doing things. And that's fine. That might be the historical moment of that board. And what you need to think about is how are you going to hold both perspectives of the long view and the shorter term, day-to-day management view. And you can do that by alternating meetings, paying attention to the long view in one meeting, the day-to-day in the other meeting, or splitting up your meeting into 2 parts. The important thing is that you're able to focus on both. If you have a working board, sometimes the long view gets forgotten because you're so busy trying to do stuff. So how do you hold both? Another question that sometimes comes up, oh, our board needs to use voting for making decisions. And this is sometimes where it comes up for me. It's like, we don't really understand what consent means, because consent, you can consider, in a sense, consent as a method of voting where it just happens that everyone is agreeing. So consider consent decision-making to be supermajority voting. But the other more critical issue might be if a board does not reach consent, which hopefully in the context of sociocracy, because there's so much feedback and so much just, framing as we work this together, that's pretty rare to expect that. But you need to have some kind of fallback for your board of directors if consent is not reachable. And I won't go into details of that. I mean, well, I'll say two options. One is you can have a fallback of to by a supermajority decide that you're going to decide by a supermajority on the issue that's on the table that you're facing. So that's one method. The other method, which is the one that we are currently looking at for Sociocracy for All, is that you remove randomly one person from the board at a time until you reach consent. And if you don't reach consent by the time you hit your quorum minimum number, then you fall back to the vote. Now that would be extremely rare and only happens after you've done everything else. Perhaps you've gone through mediation, etc., to try to resolve that particular issue. Or if you cannot reach consent, the other element that you might consider is that you really don't have a shared aim, and you really should be two organizations. And see how you can make that happen so that different people can move forward with their different aims. Another question. What does the board decide? What does this general circle and the other circles decide? And this is usually the question of, oh, but we have these legal responsibilities, fiduciary, financial oversight, etc. And yes, the board has traditional oversight responsibilities, but that doesn't mean that they need to micromanage that. They delegate that out. So the governance policy, for example, in Sociocracy for All, has been going through from one circle that was working on it to the general circle, which approved it, which then goes to the board, and the board reviews it and goes, okay, this seems to work, and we might have some questions or comments about it. The budget, the financial aspects, the general circle holds the holistic responsibility for the budget, but then also gives that to the board and say, okay, you've got the fiduciary responsibility. You need to make sure that this budget reflects the mission and values that we have. But it's not to micromanage. It's just to say, okay, this looks good. We understand it well enough that we can sign off on it without concern that we're not doing our responsible duty. Some of the challenges in bringing sociocracy to nonprofits. So one is just the generic issue of sharing power, that those who traditionally are in positions of authority have a tendency to, may have tendencies to be worried about, those other people are also going to be making this decision with me. How's that going to work? What if I don't agree with them? So there's concerns about sharing power from those who traditionally have had it. And on the other side, there's a concern about assuming power, sharing power from those who traditionally have not had it. Hey, I like to be able to go home at the end of the day and not carry any worries. I did my job and it's over. But now if I'm sharing power, that means I'm also co-responsible for this nonprofit, or at least in some of the elements that I'm involved with. And so that can be, that's a change in culture to really actually have a meaningful voice. And it can bring some discomfort. Cultural change, sociocracy, every voice mattering, is a cultural change from the traditional hierarchy and power over structure that we have. It's easier then for new and small organizations to adopt sociocracy, much harder for larger and established organizations to transition to sociocracy. Sometimes it's only when they really feel the pain of not functioning well that drives them to really go through what it takes to transition. Personal implications, it's, for me, one of the big ones is sort of the end of conflict avoidance. With the level of feedback that exists in sociocracy, any conflicts, any judgments that people have of each other are going to start surfacing. So this is one of those things that sometimes happens with the adoption of sociocracy, is whatever you haven't dealt with is going to start surfacing. And that might be a sort of a difficult passage. If you've been kind of burying conflicts for a long time, they're going to start arising because they're going to show up in your selection process, in many of your decisions, in your feedback about your meetings. So there's going to be transparency, of how we feel about how the meeting went, transparency about the bookkeeping and the finance, etc. So it does put out a greater premium on communication and, general communication, and also just communication skills. How do we relate to each other? So that's part of why we like things like nonviolent communication or other forms of, mindfulness training, etc., things that will support the quality of communications among us. And then there's the work with the external environment, legal issues, norms of the industry, etc. Like the issue of, oh, you're not supposed to have staff on the board. So working with those kinds of things. How might you get started in bringing sociocracy to your nonprofit? There's kind of what we sometimes call the stealth way, just a quiet way. And that might be simply saying in a meeting, hey, I'd really like to hear what everybody has to say on this issue. Could we do just go around with everybody? You're not calling it sociocracy. Sociocracy, after all, did not invent rounds. They've been around for millennia. But that's one way that you're then inviting everyone's voice. Or you can say, hey, this policy that we're about to say yes to, I still have some doubts about it. I really would like to see how it plays out. Can we decide that we're going to review it in a year and see, what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well? So now by putting a review date on it, you've brought in that feedback loop. On delegations of authority, just starting to allow, certain groups or certain individuals to have authority within their domains. You can create a study group, and we say more about those, but what are all the different training programs, study groups, change process that you can go through within your nonprofit. And of course, you can contact us for support in learning, training, implementing. Some resources. So Ted and I co-wrote this book, Many Voices, One Song. It's kind of the manual about sociocracy. And Ted just recently published Who Decides, Who Decides, which is oriented to the startup, to the like the first 3 meetings of an organization. Setting your aim, who decides, and how you decide, key elements. We do a lot of training in Sociocracy for All. We have our open live classes, beginner series, and the facilitation series. We have a same kind of workshops that are oriented to particular organizations, beginner and facilitation workshops for your organization. And then we have a set of video-led courses that just invites a small group of people, like 4 to 7 people, to go through the course together. And this is often done by teams who are considering how to bring sociocracy to their organization. That's a good starting place, is for the small team to go through that. And then there are more people who are oriented to how sociocracy works and can consider how to strategize bringing it to the larger nonprofit. And we do group and individual coaching, myself, Ted, and other members of Sociocracy for All.